Hello, everyone. Today we're doing something a little bit different. I'm here with Dr. Erik Goodwyn, who is, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, a psychiatrist,
Hmm.
a fantasy author, and a fellow YouTuber.
Yes.
And you have a book that just came out called King of the Forgotten Darkness.
Yes, I do.
And people will be able to find links to that in your website and your channel in the
Hmm.
description. So first off, congrats on your book's release and your first book signing. I saw you just did a video about that.
Yes,
That's
I did.
awesome.
It
How does it
was it was a
feel?
lot of fun.
Yeah, right on. I liked your you're talking about the people who came into the bookstore and talking about the different types. That really got me because I have worked in bookstores my whole life. Um, and even like now I don't, I'm not working there right now, but I sometimes work one day a week at a what is the largest used bookstore in Canada. And so yeah, it's always interesting to see who's coming in, what they're buying. It's so
Yeah,
fun to just tell stories about people like that. I love it.
sure. Yeah, and the sort of game I was playing was, can I figure out if this person would be interested in my book just by how they present themselves? And
Yeah,
being that I'm also a shrink, uh, I kind of do that in a lot of different ways anyway. So it was just another extension of that kind of idea. But it was just for fun, of course. And I
yeah,
was
for
I was
sure.
proven wrong several times, so it's all fine.
Yeah, well, that's something I've noticed from bookstores too, is that it's actually really hard to judge
Hmm.
based on one thing I noticed is that um, I worked at an Indigo, which is like Barnes and Noble, same thing basically. And what I noticed there is that first off, so many people bought romance books, and I'm talking. I worked there like years and years ago before the romantasy explosion, just
Yeah.
like normal romance books. So many people bought those, but so many men bought them, and
Mm-hmm.
even like men with beards and leather jackets would
Mm-hmm.
come and buy like a stack of romance books. So it's like it's such a mystery who reads what and what their interest, their exterior world and their interior world can be so vastly different.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's a still a bit of a stigma there. Like men aren't really supposed to be interested in that stuff,
Of course.
um,
Yeah. And
which is
well,
which is so
it's
silly.
funny because the memory that always comes to mind is that one guy I described with the beard and the leather jacket. He was walking around shopping, but he had all these romance books hiding in his jacket. So
Hmm.
he didn't want, like, literally like concealing it behind this dark coat, just
Yeah,
something so interesting about that.
right.
Um,
These are all
but
Jack Reacher books. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Clive Cussler.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so I wanted to ask you a bit because about your experience as an author and writing, because I think most of the people, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the people who come to our channels are fellow writers who want to hear writers talk about writing because I think writing is a very isolating, private experience.
It is.
And I think anyone who's spent a day writing where you have like a breakthrough, you just have a great day, and then you want to share that, you want to relate to someone, you realize it's going to be months or maybe years before anyone actually reads what this great accomplishment I just achieved today. So I think that there's a lot we could say about writing, but before I get to that, I want to ask you a bit about your experience in psychiatry and how that has sort of informed your writing. So maybe before we even get to the writing part of that, can you just tell me first, like how? Because you deal with Jung, like you do some Jungian stuff. Would you even
Yeah,
call yourself a Jungian
yeah. Oh,
psychiatrist?
yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
I'm going to the original Jung Institute this August to present.
Nice.
There's this whole debate on the nature of archetypes, and I was invited to jump in on that. And I've done a lot of that kind of stuff over the years. I got a lot into that, and that intersects with the fiction writing, in particular fantasy fiction.
Yeah.
I think because of the heavy uh, emphasis that is placed on dreams and mythology and folk tales in Jungian psychology. It's not unique to Jung, but to think about that and look at that from the point of view of like what is the deeper significance of these kind of stories. But I think Jung was really the kind of one of the first ones to bring that forward. And since then, he died in 1961, so the legacy has continued since. And there's
Hmm.
a lot of ink spilled over that kind of stuff. So it was kind of a natural fit in. In fact, I was at a conference earlier a few months ago that was entitled "Why Are So Many Jungians Writing Novels?" And I was invited to speak at that one too.
That's interesting.
Hmm.
What was the takeaway from that?
Well, just kind of what I was just saying, how it's a natural fit. So much of what you do in the process of a Jungian-oriented psychotherapy involves looking at a person's dreams and kind of the themes that emerge maybe unconsciously, and recognizing that the psyche has this strong, like, forward momentum of being a storytelling kind of entity, like the
Mm,
mind and the brain are always trying to tell stories, and they come out in dreams, but they're very symbolic in nature.
mm-hmm,
And they're about us. Like, I'll dream about my current emotional problems, but the mind doesn't typically just rehash the memories. It does do that, but it also has this other layer on it. Says, okay, but what does all this stuff mean?
mm,
And so that's where the completely new narratives will emerge in that process. And if
mm,
you recognize that they're mainly metaphorical and symbolic in nature, you can learn a lot about yourself and other, patients or whatever. Whereas if you take it literally, it seems really off the wall and random.
mm-hmm.
And I think this is super important for fantasy, which is one of the things that I love about your channel, is that you've already recognized that fantasy uses dream logic. Really, the best fantasy does. And why
Could
is
not
that?
agree
Well,
more.
because
Yeah.
the dreams are trying to sort out really important emotional truths. And fantasy is the best genre to do that in because there's no constraints on what you can use as the
Mm-hmm,
symbols.
mm-hmm,
Unfortunately, that strength is also kind of a drawback because it means that we can also come up with just silly ego fantasy stuff that
yeah.
doesn't really have a whole lot of significance other than I want to be awesome,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah. The
suddenly
wish
I tell the
fulfillment.
story, it's just poof, I'm awesome. It's
Yeah.
that's not really helpful.
Yeah. 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 The Deus Ex Machina style kind of just, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I find all that so interesting. And how did you first come to Jung? Like what drew you to him?
I'd always had an interest in dreams before I even went to medical school, but there's just so much stuff out there about them, and a lot of it is nonsense. And I was interested in the science, and
Mm-hmm.
when I got into residency, psychiatric residency, I kind of revisited that subject and started reading more about it, and that's when I found uh, Jung, and along the way, Freud and Bion and a couple of the other, like, old school guys, on top of a massive amount of empirical research in neuroscience that's been done in the last century, and of course now. And but Jung's statements and his intuitions about dreams have been very spot on in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the research since then, since he came up with his ideas, has mostly supported a lot of his ideas and elaborated on them. So I
That's
loved
cool.
it, and it's that spiritual dimension that he doesn't ignore,
Yes.
right? That I think is so critical.
Yeah. That's what exactly attracted me to Jung always because I just think that his respect for the unknown,
Yeah.
respect for the unconscious. I feel like I feel like Freud discovered the unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
but didn't respect it enough in some way. You know what I mean? That's
Mm-hmm.
my layman's interpretation, anyway.
Well, no,
Uh,
that's largely what Jung said too. He
right.
said, he had tremendous respect for Freud. The feeling was not mutual.
Yeah.
Once they broke from each other, and for a while there, he worked with Freud for
Yeah.
years, and Freud was so impressed with him, he crowned him as, like, this is the inheritor of my craft.
Yeah.
But then they had a couple of key disagreements, and Freud was very much either my way or the highway, and so he just kind of wrote him off as a kook.
Hmm.
But in Jung's writings, most of what he says is that Freud got a lot of things right, but he was overly reductive,
Yeah.
and he would treat
Yeah.
the unconscious as if it's just nothing but primitive wish fulfillments, and that's it. And there's nothing else. There's no wisdom in that. There's no ancient, ancestral voice or any of that kind of stuff. But he felt like he was wrong about that. And I think that science has since kind of vindicated his position on that.
That's could you tell me a little bit, maybe it's not the time to get into depth, but a little bit about that science, because that's news to me.
Yeah. Well, okay. So one of Freud's early ideas about dreaming, for example, was that we dream in order to protect sleep. Okay. Well, protect it from what? Well, he felt like the id had these sudden, powerful urges towards sex and violence, and those were all naughty things. And so,
Hmm.
in order to protect us from suddenly waking up with these urges, the dream sensor, which he later came to describe as the superego,
Right.
but the dream sensor was the pretty like pre superego label for the same kind of thing, would distort and basically disguise those urges into the dream narrative. And that idea has not held up to
Yeah.
empirical research. In fact, one of the most prominent researchers, Alan Hobson, basically showed and pretty much debunked that whole idea. And that's, for the most part, dream researchers and empirical research, like outside of even Jung and all that, would say, yeah, that distinction between the sort of latent id content and the manifest content, which disguising it, has not held up very well over time.
Mm.
There's a few diehards that are still out there defending the idea, but for the most part, not so much. But Jung never agreed with that anyway. That was one of the places where he disagreed with Freud. He would say, in the sharpest contradistinction to Freud, I believe the dreams are, they say exactly what they mean. There is no disguising of content. In fact, he said, nature is never diplomatic. It says
Hmm.
exactly what it means. So,
That's fascinating.
right. And so that's one way in which the empirical research and so forth has supported him. There's many others we could get into. I could go on for like 3 hours about that.
This is so cool. That's news to me. So, but yeah, why don't you tell me a bit about how your work and your research as a psychiatrist has informed your writing as a fantasy author, and where those two worlds overlap?
Well, okay, so we started talking about Le Guin,
Yes,
and one of her greatest works, of course, is A Wizard of Earthsea.
love that book.
And yeah, and you you read it and you realize this is not just about magic and spells. This is about a much deeper issue. But she's just using that language to tell a story about the development of someone. It's kind of a coming of age story where you encounter your own dark side. And it's clear, especially I've learned more from your videos on this about her, in that she was doing this deliberately. Like she understood
Hmm.
the concepts that she was using. So this was all very conscious for her.
Hmm.
And she was also very well versed in Jung as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that was really fascinating. But before that, I kind of came to a lot of the same kind of conclusions anyway, just because, again, it kind of all goes back to dreaming and how dreams, when we're dreaming, we're constructing narratives that are trying to make sense of our current life situation, but it's often, very often, in images and metaphors. Well, in writing a fantasy novel, I want to use that same kind of stuff because why write fantasy if you're not going to have fantastical stuff in it, right? It's what is it if it's not that? Like if you don't have magic or monsters or impossible things, then you might as well write something else. But because if you're going to do that, then you might as well go all in, but use it psychologically the way the dreaming mind does,
Hmm.
so that you can tell a more resonating and powerful story.
Hmm.
So you can tell a story in the same way that folk tales do, because folk tales, the reason why folk tales follow these same kind of rules about inner dynamics is because they are filtered through a kind of natural selection process over
Right.
centuries, and hundreds of generations of storytellers have condensed it down to its absolute essence. And it's the oral storytelling process that does it.
Hmm.
So we get super concentrated, highly filtered utterances that connect with our emotionality to the point where we just want to hear it again. And
Hmm.
we don't even know why, you know. But they're always about real situations, like Hansel and Gretel, for example. That's a story about the consequences of parental neglect. depicted in that story as leaving them in the woods because they can't afford to feed him, or the stepmother doesn't want to feed him, or whatever it is. Now, that story has been told throughout the world in all different kinds of guises and different cultures,
Mm-hmm.
because the possibility of parental neglect is universal.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting about it is that the story itself contains the solution to it. But again, you have to understand the symbolic nature in which it tells the story. Now, you might ask, why does the brain go through this process of telling stories via images and symbols? It's because a picture is worth 1,000 words. An image tells so much more, and in some ways can express things that can't really be verbalized that easily. And so it uses the most effective technique that's available, is telling a story in images. So when I'm writing fantasy, I do that kind of thing. Whatever it is, whatever point I'm trying to make, whatever theme I'm trying to develop, I will use what I know of how dreams would express that sort of thing to then translate that into the imagery, the setting, the characters, the plot. All of that stuff should, in my opinion anyway, try to, as best you can, revolve around your theme and all feed into it rather than being completely separate. And this is something I think that some fantasy authors out there maybe miss, is they think that world building is its own sort of thing over here, and then there's characters over there, and they're not really related to each other, but that's not true.
I
I don't,
completely agree with you.
right? The world should also be telling the same story, but from a different point of view, right? So in my novel, for example, there's two worlds, and one of them is this futuristic kind of world that's very much like this one, only we have accomplished all the things we've been trying to achieve over the centuries. In other words, there's no crime, or very little crime. There's very little suffering. We've come up, psychiatry has become so advanced that we can just get rid of any kind of suffering. If you're in pain, you can just take a drug and it goes away. If I'm upset about losing somebody that was close to me, I can take a pill and I'm not upset about it anymore. So it just posing a world like that really helps you to, I think, ask questions. You know, like,
Yeah.
is that really what we want? Well, we kind of act like that's what we want. But then I say, well, let's assume we did get it. Then what? You know,
I like that you said posing a world, as if like the world itself is posing a question.
yeah, the world. Yes,
I
it
like
is.
that.
That science fiction does that, right? Especially, and
Absolutely.
my story is mainly fantasy. The futuristic world is more of a framing device, if you will, because the other world is the fantastical world, and it's the opposite of the futuristic world. In that there's war, there's chaos, there's suffering, there's pain, but there's also beauty and mystery. And one of the ways in which all the suffering has been eliminated in Midworld is the name of it, the futuristic world, is that they've locked away the magical portals to Arantir, the fantastical world, where all of the mayhem and chaos and magic and terror happens. Well, the main character in the story, Liam, he came from the scary place as a child after a big trauma. And now he's got to go back. He realizes years later that there was somebody there that he thought was dead is actually still alive and needs his help. So he has to illegally cross into the magical world to try to save her. And he's terrified to do this because he's got all this trauma and all this kind of stuff. But as you might be able to detect here, the existence of these two worlds being opposites is posing a type of psychological question. And you can look at it as a straightforward adventure going from one world through a portal into another world. And it works on that level. I tried to write it as if that's all you wanted to do, you could enjoy it at that level. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that what I'm doing is more psychological as well. That these are two frames of mind that all of us have inside of us. This idea of achieving a perfect, fully controlled world, or braving that dark side and going into the chaos and seeing if there's anything in there of worth.
Yeah.
And I don't propose any simple solutions to this either. I think that's the problem with theme, is you don't want to be too heavy-handed with it. You want to make sure you explore all the dimensions and then let the reader come up with what they think it means. And I've had all kinds of interesting answers to that question. So that's where I've used a lot of my training. That, of course, the main character has a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder because you watch this whole family get wiped out in front of him sadistically. And so he has PTSD symptoms, which I know very well because I deal with a lot of people that have them. In fact, I had one person come back and say, I've been dealing with PTSD, and it's really weird to read this first chapter, and then the main character's going through the stuff that I go through all the time.
Wow.
Well, that's good. I'm glad I'm accurate with that.
Wow, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a question for you, which is because of your background as a psychiatrist and having been so exposed to your patients' dreams and analyzing them and understanding the symbols, do you think that you ever get to a point where maybe you're too conscious of the symbolic dimension and that maybe that gets in the way of, I don't know, giving into your unconscious, instincts of where to go with your writing? It's something I think about a lot in terms of being someone who's very, like I read a lot and I reflect a lot. And at some point I'm like, am I doing too much of this? Do I need to just like stop thinking? So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think your intuition is a good one because it is possible to overdo it. It is, and I try to defend myself again, try to insulate myself from doing that too much because I don't want to railroad the where the narrative goes. Yes, I have encountered and engaged with this kind of material in patients, but I've also done it with myself. As part of my own training, I went through therapy, and you don't really know it that well as you could unless you do it too yourself, and you're on the other side of the chair or the couch, as it were. And that's when you really encounter the mystery of it and how you can be going along and you're grappling with these various inner conflicts or traumas or emotions or whatever it is, and the unconscious will produce this stuff that seems like it's, where in the hell did that come from, right? And yet it encapsulates a lot of what you're dealing with, and it's genuinely creative and new, right? And so I think that's probably the most important lesson from various psychoanalytic schools is that we tend to think of the mind as this sort of reactive thing that it's stuff that's pumped in and then that goes through whatever and then it pumps out, and it's just a reflex. But that's not true. The mind has its own creative, like self-organizing capacity. It creates new stuff all the time. And that's what we're really trying to tap into with this. And that's where the mystery, I think, comes from, is like, because it's not real clear. Now you can analyze it and show how it probably comes from evolution and ancestral experiences and all that. If you want to dive into the scholarly side of that, you can check out my website, and I do a lot of that. But at the same time, fiction writing is not scholarly work.
You're right. Yeah.
Right? It's a creative process. And there were many times when I just sort of sat back and thought, let's just go with this because it feels right and I'm not really sure why. In which case, yeah, it could very well incorporate my own experience. But the mind doesn't have just your life history. It has the collective unconscious, which is the all the predispositions that emerge as a result of our long history as mammals and Homo sapiens and all that stuff. So that's all in there too. The example I use is the cold reflex. So if I go into a cold environment, the whole body reacts, and it shifts blood flow to different organs, and the skin, it pulls blood away from the skin. All of this stuff is oriented towards conserving heat, right? But I could go through my whole life and never know that I had that ability.
Right.
I might grow up in Hawaii or something, and then it's never cold there, so I never know. And then suddenly one day I show up and I'm in Finland or Norway or something, and it's freezing, and I'm shivering. And what is that? It's so mysterious. I never learned that, right? The classic thing of, well, where did you learn that in your life? There's some things in there that you didn't learn in your life. Yeah. They're just a part of the innate human. That's collective unconscious. That's how it works psychologically. And so a dream or like a really particularly powerful emotional, like what we would call archetypal dream, works like that too. if I encounter a very troublesome situation like coming of age or a divorce or I've just had a child, those are all things that have been around from time immemorial, probably before humans.
Mm-hmm.
So those can evoke, these particular situations can evoke trauma, grief, right? Those can evoke these responses in the same way. So I didn't want to stifle that by overanalyzing and overthinking and over-directing the process. I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
say, if I'm in this situation now, what would emerge for me, I wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another, I use that to also guide my magic system too,
Mm-hmm.
which is another conversation maybe.
Yeah. Well, the magic system is always like, the kind of one of the big draws to the genre.
Of
I think it's always
course.
like every time I'm thinking about picking up a new fantasy book, I'm always thinking about like, well, what is magic in this world?
Yeah.
How does it work, and
How does it
what does it
work?
represent? Um,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
maybe before we go there, can you tell me a bit about like your relationship to your own dreams and if that informs your writing? Like, do you ever like lift something directly from a dream and put it in your
Oh,
book?
yes.
Nice.
Definitely. There's
Like
been
big
many
plot
times.
points or like small like cosmetic things or what?
Both.
Hmm.
Both. If it was something really impactful that got to me and got under my skin, I would try to include it. Let he or she who can guess what do their best at reading my
Yeah.
book and figuring out which parts actually come from my own dream experience. Um, so
It's funny.
yeah, I definitely would do that because it's gold, right? Sometimes it's just
Yeah.
pure gold.
Yeah.
Like where the heck? And it's not to look at and say, "Oh, I'm such a genius. I'm so creative," because it's not anything I put
It's
forth,
the
right?
dreaming mind, right? Yeah. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah. It's more of the collective, like or the objective psyche is what Jung would call
mm.
it. Mhm.
I have a question for you that maybe I don't know, maybe you have a lot to say, maybe you don't, but it's about the concept of the puer aeternus,
Mm,
the Peter Pan syndrome, or the eternal
mhm.
child, which
Sure.
is something that I hear a lot in kind of like Marie Louise von Franz talks about it a
Yeah.
lot, and
Oh, okay. So
um,
you've done some homework.
I'm yeah, so I'm a like how do I put it? I have breadth, but I don't necessarily have a lot of depth in a lot of different subjects. I read widely and I like listen to lectures on YouTube and stuff like this, but I'm
Sure.
kind of all over the place with my research. But
That's cool.
but it's an interesting concept, the eternal child syndrome, because I see people who talk about how it there's kind of like a pandemic of it right now in our society, and there's lots of young men in particular who are lost and trapped in this kind of eternal reliving of this childhood moment of innocence and lack of responsibility. And
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think the relationship is of that psychological dynamic with the genre of fantasy, because I think that you and I both understand that there's a lot of depth in fantasy. Like, that's not in question right now,
Yeah.
but there's a large portion of the fan base perhaps that are sort of like in this kind of like nostalgia place where fantasy is this kind of like escape for them, perhaps. I don't know. Do you have any what do you think about this dynamic?
Yeah. The idea that fantasy is escapism
Yeah.
gets on my nerves.
Yeah. Me too. Me too.
It irritates me because yeah, there you can say there's an element of that, but I don't think escape is the right word.
Hmm.
It's more like a retreat or a renewal, even
Mm.
going back to the well of primordial creative energy, the divine. That's what I think fantasy is really about. If you're familiar with John Truby and his,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So I really like the way he breaks it down, where science fiction is more about what is the course of human history headed, um, and horror is about the invasion of one's like safety from an alien outside influence. Like that's what horror
Mm.
is always about. Um, and that led me to ask, okay, what is fantasy really about? In my opinion,
Mm.
I don't really remember exactly the way he put it, but the way I see it is that fantasy is about the human encounter with the great mystery and the divine,
Mm.
and so it can encompass the
Yeah. I
other
buy
two.
that.
Yeah. Therefore, saying that it's an escape, Okay, but what is it that you're escaping from, right? If you view the so-called real world as the enemy, then yeah, you can use fantasy as an escape, and particularly fantasy that's geared towards that, towards ego wish fulfillment and just reinforcing ego defenses. Yeah, then it's kind of an escape because you're not really living. But fantasy doesn't always have to be like that. In fact, I think the best kinds of fantasy help you to re-engage with the world in a more emotionally true and soulful way. Um, I know you're a humongous Tolkien fan, as
Yep.
was Le Guin, and of all people of even modest wisdom. And so you can look at the Lord of the Rings as a great example of someone who went through hell and back in World War One, and he managed to create this story as a kind of immune response to it.
Mm.
And there's so much. People tend to look at it as escapism, and it's all a happy ending. And I'm like, no, it is not a happy ending.
Yeah, watch the film or read the books again, because
Yeah, yeah.
that's
Like,
not really
no,
what happens there.
magic. I don't think he quite was able to really get over that sense of just immense loss, and we'll never get back the magic. We'll never get back the elves. They're all gone forever and ever. I mean, that's very
Yeah,
dark and very sad.
yeah,
But he still managed to turn that into a triumph of sorts. And I think that's the influence of Beowulf, which does the same thing.
mm.
And it
Interesting.
has that same
Yeah,
elegiac character to it. But that's another conversation, Beowulf. But is that escape? No, absolutely not. That's transformation. That's taking the crap you went through and transforming it into a narrative that's on some level uplifting, strengthening, reinforcing, meaningful.
yeah,
So that's my answer to that question.
yeah. No, I love that. I don't know. Are you familiar with the writer Gene Wolfe?
No.
He's a fan. He writes science fantasy, science fiction, and fantasy. He's kind of all over the place, but he has a quote. I think it was him who said it. Maybe I'm getting my quotes mixed up, but it was because there's the kind of commonly held belief that fantasy is for people who can't handle reality, but he says reality is for people who can't handle fantasy. And if you but the thing that I always find interesting in this conversation is that if escapism is such a bad thing, why is fantasy the one getting picked on? Because all fiction is escapism.
Yeah.
Just, you know what I mean? Like, just go live your life. If anything, fantasy is a place to process reality on
Yes.
through these
Absolutely.
symbolic terms. So it's a conversation I had a lot because I went to film school and I was with lots of people who were making very, like, socially conscious films, and which I have a lot of respect for. I think it can go too far and kind of become a PSA at a certain point.
Yeah.
But I have respect for people who are making films about reality and about issues that real people face. But I was frustrated how they didn't respect what I was doing, which was very different.
Yes.
So yeah, this is definitely a conversation that's close to my heart because I think
Well,
there's a
and
lot to say.
yeah, yeah, and I think it's a very modern idea, a very post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant sort of way
Yes.
of looking at the world. That you have to look at it as it really is.
Yeah.
And, be sober and serious and quit being such a willy-nilly, hippy-dippy, whatever. And that's not a typical attitude, really, if you look cross-culturally to fantastical narratives. Most cultures look at them. Well, it's like Terry Pratchett says something like this, like the OG of all genres is fantasy. It's
Yeah.
myth.
Yes.
Right? And why the heck do we do this if it's just meaningless? It's stupid. And again, for me, I can go back to it and justify it on the grounds of psychology and how the dreaming mind is taking the cold, hard facts of what I've experienced in my life and trying to construct a brand new story that tells me what it really means. And because it's in pure imagination, I don't have to be constrained in my symbol making by pesky things like physics and gravity and
Yeah.
all of that limiting crap. I can express the symbols in the most emotionally true way possible, which means that the fantasy genre is the most realistic of all genres, not the least.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I like that.
And so but again, the strength is also the weakness. Because I'm unfettered and unconstrained, I can also tell frivolous, silly whiz-bang stories,
Mhm.
that don't really reflect anything. But the problem comes when you conflate the two. And I think the biggest challenge with the whole it's escapism business is that it erects this rigid boundary between the so-called real world and the world of imagination, and they're completely separated and never have anything to do with each other. That's crap. That's
Yeah.
total crap. Or else why in the world would we dream in the way that we do, right? And why is it the imaginal experience just as real as the so-called real experience, right? It's just another dimension of our subjective life,
Yeah. Le
right? Why are we
Guin.
arbitrarily saying this is okay and this is we should forget about?
Yeah.
Based on what?
Yeah. I mean, like, if we didn't have imagination, where would we be? Like, we would never have, let alone built airplanes. We've never, had fires. We would never have gotten off the ground.
Here's a little known fact. So the imagination is responsible not just for flights of fancy, but for practical real world things like, oh, I don't know, memory,
Yeah.
future planning, right? If the parts of the brain, like the infraparietal cortex, for example, are impaired, or the hippocampus, the ventral tegmental area, some of these areas in the brain, I don't know if you know much neuroscience, but
None.
okay, all right. Well, then for anyone out there who's listening, the midline subcortical structures, a lot of those central areas, if they get damaged, you not only lose the ability to recall memory easily or plan for the future, but you also have a really hard time imagining things too.
Hmm.
Just constant. And the reason is because the imagination is at the core of all of it. We don't really retrieve memories from some mysterious data bank in our brain. Anyway, it's not really how it works. Actually, what we do is we construct a reasonable facsimile of what more or less happened in the past. And that's about as good as it gets. But notice how efficient that is. All I need is to store a little tiny bit of data, and the imagination system does the rest of the work for us. It cooks up this mostly realistic scenario. But that's why memory has so many quirks to it, because it's often recalled in a way that you couldn't have recalled it, like from a third person point of view, for example, like you couldn't have been a bird. But that's how we sometimes remember things. Or, you infer that somebody threw a frisbee out the window. You didn't see him, but you'll remember seeing somebody throw the frisbee, because the brain just fills up all the rest of it with imagination. Now, if we couldn't do that, we'd be utterly useless. But we couldn't do hardly anything. So the imagination is not just there for little kids to come up with zany stories. It's extremely functional to pretty much everything we do.
Yeah.
Right. And future planning, of course, uses the imagination as well.
Totally. I mean, yeah, it's just a funny thing, because it's like I want to justify the imagination in its own right, and not only because it's like a useful tool, but also it's like if you're a businessman and you're starting a business, you gotta have some imagination. You know what I mean? It's like that's just, it's so yeah. I never understood that sort of like poo-pooing of imagination. But Le Guin, in her essays, and I've done a couple videos now about her essays, but she has like books of essays, like several books, and she's often talking about the imagination. Like that's sort of like the subject for her that she's like continuously coming back to. And she says in a few places for her, in the Earthsea books in particular, that magic is supposed to be about creativity. It's about what an artist does when they create, when they imagine things. And for her, that's this long sort of metaphor she's unfolding across those books.
Oh, absolutely. And I came to the same conclusion without having read Le Guin. In the earlier drafts of King of the Forgotten Darkness, the magic system is based on that exact same idea, that it's about creativity. Now, I give it a darker edge as well, too, in the sense that the ability to be creative has two sides to it. On one end, it can help you in a lot of different ways and help you do things that you might not have known that you could do. That's the metaphor of magic and spells being able to alter reality, see? But then there's another side of it where it can be maddening, and it can drive you up the wall. And every spell, so in my world, every spell that you learn, and those things only work in Errantier, just so you know. But every spell that you learn comes with a mark, and it will afflict you at some random time that you don't know. And so, like,
Mm.
that's, again, all of this is kind of a metaphor for someone who has a very powerful creative capacity to them. And just the recognition that it doesn't come for free.
Hmm.
And as a fellow writer, you probably understand that intense urge to finish the book, right? And it can drive you bonkers sometimes, like, you know.
Oh, I could talk about that for a long time, and
Yeah,
it brings out a
exactly.
dark side of me sometimes too. When things get in the way of me, you
Yes.
know, you can probably see behind me. This is my office. There's no doors on this room. I live with three animals and another human being, and I, like I'm trying to be good. I'm not trying to be Jack Nicholson from The Shining. You know what I mean? You know, I'm trying to be like nice about it, but it's like, you know,
Hmm.
when you have tasted that flow state,
Yes.
when you know what it's like to be there,
Yeah.
it can be really frustrating when things get in your way.
Well, and yeah, and that's one thing. So one of the characters, a friend of Liam's, when they go through the portal together, she's one of these super creative types, but she's never been in the magical world before. But she's
Mm.
been obsessed with creating, and her thing is art, is drawing, and she draws all these wild situations and weird demons and all this kind of stuff. And she gets all kinds of criticism from it in Midworld because Midworld is a super boring place.
Yeah.
But when she transitions, all of a sudden the magic powers erupt within her, and it. But if you don't recognize that the magic is really just another way of depicting that creative impulse, and that not everybody has it, and some people have it to excess, and what is the problems it causes? If you don't recognize that, it'll seem as though she's like learning magic really quickly, but it's explained in there that no, she's been working on it her whole life. She just wasn't in the right setting yet. So
Hmm.
then that's where the meaning comes through
Hmm.
in this, in not only just the setting, but the plot and the characters all converge on the theme, which I don't have to say, right? Because I suspect that you get it already. And I think that's the best
Love it.
way. That's the best way that you can construct a story. Is if there was any other way, better way to say it, that I could just tell you.
Exactly, right? Like if you can summarize everything you need to say in 140 characters, then you
Then
could
why not
just
just do
do a
that?
tweet, make a tweet, and then your work's done. You don't have to, you know, suffer for this for months or years or however long it
Right.
takes.
Yeah. And well, especially now that the industry, and particularly in fantasy, we have this problem where debut authors have to. There's this huge amount of pressure for us to write short debut
Yeah,
novels, right? It's got to
that's
be
a
no.
big problem for me. Huge
Yeah,
problem for me.
and fantasy, like everybody's used to, Brandon Sanderson or Martin, who writes these big door stops, right?
Stephen
And they,
Erickson. Yeah.
yeah, right, Stephen Erickson, and these are all great authors, no argument there, but they can do stuff that debut authors can't do. But then I don't think a lot of the readers necessarily know that, and they'll be like, "Well, it should have been longer." And like, yeah, I wanted it to be longer, bro.
Hmm.
The publisher's like, "Can you cut 20,000 words from this?" I'm like, "Are you insane? You want the story to be completely useless?"
I mean, that's so hard because it's like you think that these publishers would have a knowledge of and a respect for the genre and understand that length is an aspect of the genre, in my opinion. I think that all if you look at all the great works of fantasy, maybe the only one that's under 120,000 words or whatever is maybe Wizard of Earthsea. Like I guess there's a few. There's The Last Unicorn and stuff like that. But like in terms of like epic fantasy, it's all long. It's in the name. It's epic, right? And I
Mhm.
think it's just like yeah, debut authors are definitely in a tough spot with that.
Yeah.
And but but I think I'm hoping that the self publishing thing that's going on right now will open up. I think there's problems with that too.
Yeah.
And there's definitely pros and cons on both sides, and it's a challenge to be a writer right now, no matter how you're approaching it.
Truly. Yeah.
Um,
But I think fantasy authors have one of the biggest challenges because, yeah, where do you start? I mean, it's
yeah,
being that it's anything goes, right? It's fantasy, right? So I can make it anything. But then many times that's not really all that good,
yeah.
you know. But that's a different conversation.
Is your book is self published? Like are you with a publisher?
No, it's a small publisher called. So Collective Inc. is the name of the publisher, but they
Oh,
have a
right
lot of
on.
different imprints, and so this one's under Roundfire Press. which deals mainly with fantasy and sci-fi.
Right on. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they were the ones that were asking me if I could cut 20,000 words off, and it's like, it's already 96,000. That's really
Oh, that's not even that long. Yeah.
no, it's not. And they wanted me to cut it down more to be more financially viable. I'm like, I'm thinking to myself, no, I didn't do that. I didn't cut it, and they let it pass. But I was thinking to myself, yeah, it'll make it unreadable, in which case you're not going to sell any. Yeah. So why would you, but what do I know?
It's one of those things where it's like the story knows how long it wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're doing your job as a writer, you're respecting your story, you're giving it its own, what it needs. And so it's hard to come at it from those external kind of just like, well, this is the word length we want for a story, regardless of them actually reading it and saying, yeah, there's parts here that could be cut because they're not developing the plot or whatever.
Right.
Two completely different ways of approaching that.
Truly. And that's the fine art of it all, isn't it?
Yeah.
How long do I make this chapter? Well, have you squeezed all the emotion that you can out of it? And if not, then you need to make it longer, not shorter.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I read for a living. Like my day job is reading screenplays, and I've started reading some novels and short stories too. And a note I often give people is that people will rush into a moment too quickly. Like I feel like sometimes I want the writer to kind of like it's a dance, right? You need to like feel the rhythm of it, and like each moment needs to bring me into the correct emotional space for that moment. Yeah. And so I think there's a weird kind of like obsession with brevity, which at times is important, but like you just got to understand the context. You got to feel the rhythm of that dance, Yeah.
Like if you're going to have a big moment, like in my story, for example, going through the gate.
Yes. That's a huge moment, right?
It's a huge moment. I could have done it in chapter 1, but then it would have fallen flat.
We wouldn't have understood the significance of it without that context.
You've got to have as much context as you can get in there without dragging it out, right? So that's the balance. You have to have just the right amount of buildup, and then once you get there, right, you don't want to just immediately jump into, okay, now we got to do this.
Yeah.
Right. You've got to give some time to breathe and like let everybody settle into an entirely different new world. This is a particular kind of narrative problem that this particular kind of fantasy, portal fantasy, has. And if you don't solve this problem, like Truby talks about this a lot, then it ain't going to work. So, but yeah, I agree with you. They'll rush into it. They'll think the scene itself is what does it, but that's not it. It's the scene itself plus all the context that you just imported into it.
Exactly.
Then you got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you got to do that without info dumping.
Yeah. Oh yes, the info dump.
The dreaded.
So are you a pantser or a planner or something in between?
Okay, so first and foremost, I would like to submit to the writing community that the dichotomy between pantser and plotter is bullshit.
Thank you so much. That is also my position whenever this question comes up.
It's nonsense.
I've never understood it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you can just sit down and just write a story out of nowhere, I think is a romantic nonsense,
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, the whole idea of the stream of consciousness thing, I think people misunderstand that because it's like, if you look at the writers of stream, like James Joyce, for example, stream of consciousness, Ulysses, he didn't write it as a single stream. He edited it to like create the impression of that, right?
So it's like ridiculous.
Yes, exactly. And all writing is the artist being deliberate. Yeah. And often you get to the end and you go, oh, that's what my story's about. And then you got to go back to the start again and make sure that that's there.
But that said, I did plot out and plan a ton, but just with the knowledge that when I started writing the actual first draft of it, I could very easily, and in many cases should, scrap what I had planned.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a roadmap, but this side path seems like it might actually be better. So I'm going to go down that way and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And then maybe it's not ever, maybe you have to come back.
And maybe it sucks.
But who knows?
Case, oh, well, at least I tried. But, so that you want to be in tune with that continuously creative energy that the pantsers are talking about all the time.
Yeah.
But then you've got to have some kind of a roadmap or else you're just going to wind up getting lost in a blind alley. And even guys like Stephen King have an idea of where they're going. And,
Yeah.
and I think in King's sense, he's absorbed and internalized so many rules of the craft, as it were. They can do that without really having to think too much about it. Like, you can just sort of ride that bike without worrying about where the pedals are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like in a video game where you're not controlling like right foot, left foot. You're just pressing forward, you know?
Yeah. Or I'm having the thought, go shoot that guy behind the wall. And then I just do it. Right. Without actually worrying about where my fingers are and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Exactly. So when you set out to write, do you start with like you're saying you're doing some planning and you're keeping it open, but like my theory, and I might do a video about this soon, but my theory is that there's essentially two types of writers, and those are some who start with narrative ideas, like they have like an idea for a scene or what happens or what the climax looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's other writers who start with like character and start with like something a bit more less structured, more like emotionally grounded.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as I'm assembling some research here for this video I may or may not do, where do you start with writing? Do you start more on the character side or more on the plot side?
I start with the theme.
Okay.
Yeah. And
There
I
you
build
go.
everything else around it. That's my spine, is what is the theme? And it morphs sometimes through the process. And I find that, well, maybe this is the theme. It's a related theme. It's similar to what I started with, but it's not quite what I started with, but it works better. Right. But I've got to ask myself, okay, in what way can I show this through a character's arc? The point, whatever point I'm trying to make or explore, because sometimes it's not like a definitive statement, like we should always do this, and I can just build it. If you do that, you're going to come across as preachy,
Yeah.
and heavy-handed or ham-fisted or whatever. And so it might be like, for King of the Forgotten Darkness, a lot of it is about the nature of suffering, and do we avoid it? Do we confront it? What is the risks, the benefits, the costs of all of the different angles? And I'll take the main character and have him go through the arc, but then not have like that as the final answer, because I've got other characters too that are also orbiting that same question, but come up with a different answer.
Right.
And then allow that to breathe and see what emerges from that, so that when the reader looks at that, they can go, what is the right answer here?
Yeah.
I want you to come up with that. I don't want to just spoon feed it.
Yeah.
And that's also a very therapeutic kind of thing.
I think stories are good about asking questions like that, exploring ideas, having the characters have these different answers to the questions.
Yeah.
Kind of relieves you, the writer, from having all the answers, right?
Of
you
course.
Can be like,
Right,
this character and this character, and let's see how they interact. And,
Mm-hmm. Now, one writer that I think did this brilliantly in terms of story, but poorly in execution, would be George Lucas's prequel trilogy. And the themes he explored in there are just amazing, and the way in which he does it is really great. But then the scene-to-scene execution of it is often quite clunky. I still love them. Don't get me wrong.
I was going to say we might disagree there, but
yeah, I still love the prequels.
I get it. Yeah.
But you know what I mean. Like
I do.
They're not perfect. Yeah, the dialogue is kind of.
Well, aren't they perfect? Okay.
Yeah. Well, they're really awesome. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
And I love the way that he explores the idea of how basically love is what led to the downfall. I mean, that's not a typical thing you would think of, but is it? But then, of course, you can always sit back and go, well, is it love, though? Is it more possession? And what's the difference there? Is there one? And all that. And Lucas leaves that open to.
Well, that's what I love about those stories, is that they give you psychological meat to chew on. Like there's something there for you to work through, and kind of you can come back and be like, there's something there that reminds me of something. And I feel like all good fiction feeds the psyche in that way. Like there's something there that you can connect with and you can think about later.
Mm-hmm. It's those kinds of stories. And I think, again, I argue fantasy is the best arena for this. Give you the space to chew on these in a way that is manageable.
Yeah.
because you could easily get lost in all of the nuances and everything. But if in images and symbols, you can play around with it and go, how does that, how does that,
Yeah.
do I have the high ground here?
Yeah. What is the high ground?
What is the high ground? What is he really, does he mean literally he has the high ground, or he has the moral high ground?
Yeah. These are the
And
questions
the
that keep me up at night.
Yes. He has both.
Yeah, he has both. Oh, love it. Well, maybe we should leave it there for now. I know our time is limited, but there's always so much more we could talk about. This has been an amazing conversation. I'm really glad we did this.
Same.
Yeah, I'll remind everyone to check out the description where there'll be links to all sorts of things. And thanks for setting this up, Erik. Thanks for reaching out. This has been so much fun.
Well, let's do it again.
Yeah, sounds good to me.